Welcome back, everyone. Today we're going deep, really deep, into a topic that's often misunderstood or maybe just overlooked. We're talking residential segregation in America.
Yeah, it's something that, well, most people think is, ancient history.
Right, like we had the civil rights movement. Everything's fixed. End of story.
Exactly. But the reality is a lot more complicated, and the effects of that segregation,
Hmm.
those are still very much alive today.
And that's what we're going to untack.
Mm-hmm.
Our guides for this deep dive. Two really powerful books by Richard Rothstein. We've got The Color of Law,
A classic,
absolutely, and then his follow-up, Just Action.
which really takes those historical insights from The Color of Law
Hmm.
and says, okay, now what? Like, how do we actually move forward?
Love that. So listeners, if you're ready to have some assumptions challenged, buckle up.
You're going to be surprised, I guarantee it.
Yeah.
One of the biggest things Rothstein tackles is this idea that residential segregation just happened naturally.
Right, right. Like birds of a feather flock together or something.
Yeah, like people just prefer to live near those who look like them, share their culture, whatever. Or it's all about economics. Who can afford to live where?
Which on the surface can sound kind of reasonable.
Sure, until you start digging deeper. And that's where Rothstein's work is so brilliant. He dismantles that whole de facto segregation argument.
Okay, pause there for a sec. For our listeners who aren't familiar with these terms, what's the difference between de facto segregation and the de jure segregation Rothstein's talking about?
So de facto means in fact or in practice, basically suggesting that things just kind of ended up this way organically.
Yeah.
But de jure, that means by law.
Ah, okay, so like it was intentional.
Precisely. Rothstein's whole argument hinges on this. He says segregation in America wasn't some accident. It was a direct result of laws and policies.
Whoa, hold on. So we're not talking just about like the Jim Crow South?
Nope, this was happening all over the country. Absolutely. Rothstein gives examples from every region, north, south, east, west. And a big focus is the federal government, playing a key role in actually designing this segregated system.
Okay, so not just a few isolated policies here and there. We're talking like a whole web of laws.
Exactly. It was a systematic effort that touched everything from where houses were built, to who got loans, to how transportation was planned.
Wow. Okay, I think our listeners need some specifics. Like, what kind of policies are we actually talking about? Paint us a picture of how this worked on the ground.
Okay, so picture this. Public housing. Early on, it was mostly built for white families.
Hmm.
And it was intentionally located to essentially keep black families segregated.
Wow. Okay, so it wasn't just like happenstance that public housing ended up in certain neighborhoods. They deliberately chose locations to reinforce separation.
You got it. Then you've got the post-World War II era. Huge suburban boom, right?
Yeah.
The Federal Housing Administration, the FHA.
Oh, yeah. Everyone
Yeah.
was getting those FHA loans to buy their little piece of the American dream.
Right. Except if you were black. Routinely denied mortgages or steered into neighborhoods that were already struggling.
It's hard to fathom that was happening on such a scale.
It was systematic. Rothstein even quotes the FHA's own underwriting manual.
Wait, their official guidelines said,
They straight up advised against insuring mortgages in racially mixed neighborhoods, claimed it would cause instability and lead to financial loss.
so they literally created the problem they were pretending to avoid.
Exactly, a self-fulfilling prophecy. By saying integration would cause problems, they made sure it would be almost impossible. And of course, this meant black families were denied that chance to build wealth through homeownership.
Right, that generational wealth that comes from owning a home that appreciates in value.
Exactly. While white families were building equity, moving up the ladder, black families were shut out.
The ripple effects are enormous.
Hugely impactful. And it wasn't just about being excluded. Rothstein also talks about how black families were, in many cases, exploited. He tells this story of Morris Goldseeker. He was a real estate speculator in Baltimore, preyed on black families desperate for decent housing.
Ugh, how?
He'd sell them homes on contract. Sounds okay on the surface, but the terms were predatory. Families wouldn't build any equity, and if they missed one payment, bam, they lost everything.
So he was profiting off of their limited options.
Absolutely. And it wasn't just the government involved in all this. You had banks, real estate agents, even universities playing a role.
Universities.
They would enforce these things called restrictive covenants. Basically, clauses written into property deeds that barred people of color from owning or even living in certain areas.
Wait, seriously? So it would literally be in the legal document for the house?
Yep. And these covenants were upheld in courts for decades. Imagine, you can afford a house, the seller is willing, but you're blocked. because of this language in the deed.
It's mind-boggling how blatant it was.
It was a system designed to control who lived where, and race was the deciding factor.
So it's clear the government was heavily involved. But you mentioned other institutions like newspapers. What role did they play?
You'd think newspapers would be exposing this injustice, but many were complicit. They'd run housing ads with blatant discrimination.
Like straight up saying whites only.
You got it. Shocking to see how normalized that was.
It really is. Okay, so we've got universities, these covenants, newspapers. What about real estate agents? Were they involved too?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Some would flat out steer black buyers away from white neighborhoods, even if they could afford it.
And then there was that awful practice, blockbusting, right?
Blockbusting, the worst. Basically, agents would scare white homeowners into selling cheap. Tell them black families are moving in, property values are going to plummet. Then they'd turn around and sell those same houses to black families at inflated prices.
Profiting off of fear and prejudice.
Exactly. And it accelerated segregation in so many neighborhoods.
It's wild to think how deeply entrenched this whole system was, and to think many people believe it was just a Southern thing. But Rothstein shows us this was nationwide, an American problem fueled by government policy.
Absolutely. And this is where things get really interesting. Rothstein doesn't just lay out this history. He connects it to the issues we're grappling with today. The racial wealth gap, disparities in education, healthcare, even life expectancy.
It's all connected.
Deeply. And those effects, they last for generations. Remember that point we made earlier about black families being shut out of home ownership?
Yeah, that lost opportunity to build wealth.
That loss has had a ripple effect through generations. Think about it. That missed chance at home equity is wealth you can't pass down. Wealth that could have meant a better education, a safety net, maybe starting a business.
It's heartbreaking. I bet our listeners are thinking about their own neighborhoods right now, wondering, was this happening here too?
It's a question we should all be asking. And it wasn't just about being excluded, like we talked about with those restrictive covenants. There was also exploitation, like that story of Morris Goldseeker in Baltimore, the real estate speculator who took advantage of black families desperate for housing.
Yeah, that story was just infuriating. Selling them those homes on contract, knowing they'd likely lose everything if they missed even one payment.
It was a way to make a profit off of their vulnerability. And it wasn't just individuals like Goldseeker. Institutions were complicit too. Remember those restrictive covenants?
Oh yeah, written right into the deeds, barring people of color from living there.
Well, universities enforced those. Banks denied loans based on race. Real estate agents steered buyers. Newspapers ran discriminatory ads. It was a whole network of complicity.
Wait, hold on. Those restrictive covenants, you said they were actually legally enforceable.
Oh, yeah, for decades. It was wild, right? It meant even if a homeowner wanted to sell to a black family, they might be legally prevented because of that language in the deed.
That is just crazy. Okay, so we've talked about universities, those covenants. But what about newspapers? How are they actually involved?
Well, you'd think they'd be reporting on this injustice, right? But many newspapers were actively participating. Imagine picking up your local paper and seeing ads that say, whites only.
It makes me sick to my stomach just thinking about it. And you mentioned real estate agents steering buyers, too.
Absolutely. If a black family tried to buy in a white neighborhood, some agents would just flat out refuse to show them houses, even if they could afford it.
Yeah.
And then there was this whole blockbusting scheme.
Right, right. Tell our listeners about that again, because I'm not sure everyone knows what that means.
So imagine you're a white homeowner, living your life, and suddenly these real estate agents are knocking on your door, whispering about black families moving into the neighborhood, telling you your property value is about to plummet, scaring you into selling cheap.
Exploiting racial fears to make a quick buck.
Exactly. And then they take that same house and sell it to a black family at a much higher price. They were playing both sides, profiting off of prejudice and fear, and it contributed to the rapid segregation of entire neighborhoods.
It's just incredible how deeply ingrained this whole system of segregation was. And it wasn't just the South. Rothstein makes it clear this was a nationwide issue, an American problem built on a foundation of deliberate government policies.
Exactly. And here's the kicker.
Yeah.
The effects of those policies are still very much with us today. That's what we're going to dive into next.
Yes. We've got to talk about the lasting impact of all this. It's not just history, it's shaping our present.
And it's shaping our future, too, unless we do something about it. That's where Just Action comes in Rothstein's blueprint for change. Stay tuned, listeners. We've got a lot more to uncover.
Absolutely, we're just getting started.
It's really about lost potential, not just for those families directly affected, but for our society as a whole.
I see what you mean. Imagine if those families had been able to build that wealth, all the businesses that could have been started, the opportunities that could have been created.
Exactly. And on the flip side, those same policies that were holding black families back were creating predominantly white suburbs with better funded schools, more access to jobs.
A system built on inequality. And we're still dealing with those consequences today.
That's the thing that Rothstein really hammers home in Just Action, his follow-up to The Color of Law.
Yeah.
It's not enough to just acknowledge this history. We have to talk solutions.
Okay, so what does he propose? What can we actually do to address this legacy of segregation and its impact, which, as you've said, continues to this day?
Well, he doesn't offer any quick fixes. It's a really complex problem, and he advocates for a multi-pronged approach. But he does lay out some concrete policy solutions and actions that could really move the needle.
I'm all ears. Give our listeners some specifics. What are some of the key things we can do to start moving in the right direction?
One of the biggest things he focuses on is housing policy. He's a big proponent of what he calls affirmatively furthering fair housing.
Okay, break that down for us. What does that mean?
It's about going beyond just saying, okay, no more discrimination, and actually taking proactive steps to promote integration and create equal opportunity in housing.
That phrase, affirmatively furthering, is really powerful. It suggests real intentionality, a commitment to righting those historical wrongs.
Exactly. It means looking at things like zoning laws that make it almost impossible to build affordable housing in more affluent suburbs. It means investing in existing black neighborhoods, schools, infrastructure, resources, things that have been, let's be honest, neglected for decades.
So it's not just about giving people a chance to move. It's about making the communities they're already in better, more livable, more prosperous.
Right. It's a two-pronged approach. Open up opportunities in new areas and invest in existing communities. And even when black families do have options to move, it's often not easy. Finding landlords willing to rent to them, being able to afford those higher rents, overcoming prejudice and bias.
It's like an uphill battle on multiple fronts.
Exactly. And that's where things like down payment assistance programs or rent regulation become so important, giving people a real chance to succeed.
And protections against eviction, too, right? Ensuring families have stability and aren't constantly at risk of losing their homes.
Absolutely. And it's not just about government programs. Rothstein talks about holding institutions accountable too, making sure banks, insurance companies, real estate agencies, even universities are responsible for their role in this whole system. He even advocates for reparations as a way to, well, address the massive wealth gap that was created by these policies.
Okay, now I'm curious about something. Rothstein focuses a lot on black communities, but what about Hispanic families? They experience segregation too, right? Where does that fit into his argument?
It's a great question, and he addresses it head on. He argues that while Hispanic families might initially cluster together in what are called ethnic enclaves when they first immigrate, they tend to integrate more readily into broader society after a few generations.
Interesting. So for Hispanic families, it's more about that natural assimilation process that often happens with immigrant groups. Whereas for black families, it's been this intentional and systemic exclusion going back centuries.
Exactly, and he points out that the data on Hispanic segregation can be misleading because it often lumps together recent immigrants and those who've been here for generations. When you look specifically at third-generation Hispanic families, their levels of segregation are much lower.
So the experience isn't always the same, even if both groups are facing challenges.
Right. And it's important to remember, even if Hispanic families are, in a sense, assimilating more quickly, they still absolutely face discrimination and barriers.
Absolutely. And that's why it's so important to look at these issues systemically.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Rothstein isn't just talking about tweaking housing policy. He's talking about dismantling the whole structure of racial inequality that impacts every part of American life.
It's a huge task, but it's crucial work. You know, it can be easy to get bogged down in all the negativity, but one of the things I found really encouraging in Just Action was his focus on grassroots efforts, the success stories that are out there.
Yeah, those stories are crucial. They give us hope, show us that change is possible. Like the Folded Map Project in Chicago. It connects residents from different neighborhoods, black and white, affluent, and low income. They literally fold a map to bring those communities closer together, build relationships across those divides.
I love that. It's about moving beyond statistics and stereotypes, seeing each other as human beings.
Exactly. It reminds me of, remember when we were talking about newspapers being complicit in perpetuating segregation?
Oh, yeah, those discriminatory ads. It's hard to believe something like that was happening so openly.
It was a different time, for sure. But then you have stories like the Presbyterian ministers in Winston-Salem, who, instead of perpetuating division, brought black and white church members together to foster dialogue, create personal connections, change happening at the community level.
Love that. And then there's organizations like the Durham Community Land Trust. They're working to create and preserve affordable housing in gentrifying neighborhoods, fighting to prevent the displacement of Black residents that often happens when those areas get investment.
It's about creating truly inclusive communities, right, where everyone has a chance.
Exactly. Okay, now we've talked about policy solutions, these incredible grassroots efforts, but what about this whole idea of implicit bias? It's such a hot topic these days. What's Rothstein's take on that?
He's definitely aware of the research on implicit bias,
Hmm.
but he's a little cautious about its practical implications.
So.
He worries that focusing too much on individual bias can actually distract from those bigger systemic issues at play.
So it's not that he's dismissing implicit bias entirely. It's more that he's saying it shouldn't overshadow the need for systemic change.
Exactly. We can't just focus on fixing individuals. We need to fix the systems that create and perpetuate inequality in the first place.
I think that's a really important point. It's easy to get caught up in those individual level solutions and forget that real lasting change requires a much bigger shift.
Absolutely. And this actually leads us to another kind of controversial topic: affirmative action.
Oh, interesting. Rothstein doesn't shy away from tough topics.
Not at all. And this is one where he challenges some of the, well, more traditional liberal approaches to addressing racial inequality.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What are his critiques of affirmative action?
Well, he argues that while affirmative action programs are definitely well-intentioned, they've become too narrowly focused on diversity rather than true integration. He sees it as a way for institutions to kind of pat themselves on the back without really addressing those root causes of inequality.
So he's not against diversity, but he's saying it's not enough on its own. We need to go deeper, actually redistribute resources and power in a way that genuinely benefits Black communities.
Exactly. And that's where his argument for reparations comes in. He sees reparations as not just about compensating for past injustices,
Right.
but as a way to actually level the playing field, create a more equitable future.
It's a controversial idea, but given all the evidence Rothstein lays out, it's definitely a conversation we need to be having.
Absolutely. And he's trying to shift the conversation away from blame and guilt and towards a sense of shared responsibility. He makes the case that a more integrated society isn't just morally right, it's actually beneficial for everyone.
Oh, interesting. So how does he argue that segregation harms not only Black communities, but also white communities?
He challenges this notion that white people somehow lose out if Black people gain ground. He argues that segregation creates this atmosphere of fear, distrust, resentment. And that's harmful to everyone.
Yeah, it prevents us from really seeing each other as human beings. It creates these artificial barriers between us.
Exactly. And it makes it easier for politicians to exploit those divisions, right? Pitting working class people against each other, focusing on racial anxieties instead of the real issues that affect us all.
It's a distraction tactic, a way to keep us fighting amongst ourselves instead of challenging the systems that are keeping us all down.
Right. And he argues that this is one of the reasons why it's been so difficult to build those multiracial coalitions that are so essential for making real progress.
It's a reminder that this isn't about Black people versus white people. It's about creating a system that works for everyone. I gotta say, reading Just Action, I was really struck by Rothstein's optimism. He seems to really believe that we can overcome this legacy of segregation.
He does, doesn't he? It's refreshing.
But does he acknowledge how incredibly difficult, how long-term this is going to be?
He does. He's not naive. He knows we're talking about dismantling centuries of systemic racism, and that's not going to happen overnight. He even points out how some recent Supreme Court decisions have actually made it harder to address segregation by limiting the tools available to policymakers.
Okay, so if even the Supreme Court is working against us, how can we possibly make progress? Does Rothstein offer any hope?
He says we can't just rely on the courts. We need to build a social movement that's powerful enough to overcome those legal obstacles. And he gets really specific about what people can do.
Okay, I'm ready. Give our listeners some examples. What can we do to get involved?
He talks about monitoring bank lending practices in your community, making sure they're not discriminating against black borrowers. Support organizations that are creating affordable housing, like that Durham Community Land Trust we talked about. He even encourages people to examine the deeds to their own homes
Wait, what? Look at your own deed. What for?
to see if it contains that racist language we talked about earlier,
Hmm.
those restrictive covenants. It might sound strange, but it's about bringing it home, making it personal. This isn't just some abstract historical issue. It's woven into the fabric of our neighborhoods.
Wow, yeah, that's powerful. It forces you to confront it head on.
Exactly. And that's where change begins, right?
Mm.
With awareness and action. And he's not just talking about individual actions. He talks about putting pressure on institutions, too. Like, he calls out the Chevy Chase Land Company, which developed one of the most exclusive and expensive suburbs in the D.C. area. He says they should use their resources to help subsidize black families moving into the neighborhood.
Wow, bold.
Right. He's basically saying, if you're serious about racial justice, put your money where your mouth is.
Love it. And it's not just about targeting those elite institutions. He also goes after seemingly neutral entities, like newspapers.
Oh, yeah, the Baltimore Sun.
Yes, and real estate agencies. He criticizes the National Association of Realtors for actively supporting discriminatory practices, even campaigning against fair housing laws.
It's mind-blowing how entrenched this whole system was. And it's still affecting us today.
That's why Rostein's work is so important. He's pulling back the curtain on this hidden history and challenging us to take responsibility. And it's not just about housing and real estate. He goes after the insurance industry, too.
He makes the case that discrimination in insurance is just as pervasive, but it's often harder to spot.
So how do we even know it's happening? And how do we address it?
Rothstein talks about this technique called paired testing. Basically, you send a black applicant and a white applicant to apply for insurance and see what happens. It's a way to get hard data and expose those discriminatory practices.
We need more of that. And we need strong enforcement of fair housing laws. We've got to hold these institutions accountable.
Absolutely. And he doesn't stop there. He says we can't just be satisfied with prohibiting discrimination. We need to be proactive, create policies that actually encourage integration.
And he highlights some success stories, right? Like Oak Park, Illinois, which has been intentionally working towards racial diversity and integration for over 50 years.
Yeah, they've achieved a remarkable level of integration and created this really thriving community with great schools, high quality of life.
It's proof that it can be done. And then there's Cleveland Heights, Ohio.
They actually became more intentional about integration after seeing the really intense fight for school desegregation in nearby Cleveland. It was a turning point for them.
And they didn't just focus on housing, they also worked on integrating the schools, understanding how interconnected those two issues are.
You're right. It was a really comprehensive approach. They even banned for sale signs in the 1960s to prevent blockbusting.
Wow, I never thought about that. It's incredible to see how creative communities can be in their efforts to create a truly integrated society.
It's inspiring. And it shows that we need policies at all levels, local, state, and federal, to actually encourage and support this kind of work.
He talks about things like inclusionary zoning, which requires developers to set aside a certain percentage of units in new housing developments for low and moderate income families.
Exactly. And he argues for reforming the low-income housing tax credit program, too. Right now, it's structured in a way that often reinforces segregation. He wants those tax credits to be used to build affordable housing in high-opportunity neighborhoods, not just concentrate poverty in already segregated areas.
It seems like the key takeaway here is intentionality. We can't just sit back and hope for integration to happen. We need to be proactive and create policies that actively encourage and incentivize diversity and inclusion.
Right. And it's not just about policy, it's about culture, too. Creating a society where diversity is valued and people from all backgrounds are truly welcomed and respected.
I think that's one of the most powerful takeaways from both the color of law and just action.
Yeah.
This isn't a black problem or a white problem, it's an American problem, and it's going to take all of us working together to solve it.
He really is presenting a call to action, and he's providing real solutions.
Speaking of solutions, one thing Rothstein points out that I found really interesting is how white Americans often overestimate the progress we've made on racial equality.
Yeah, I remember that part. He mentions a poll where, get this, 71% of Republicans believe the U.S. has made a lot of progress in the last 50 years in ensuring equal rights for all Americans. But only 29% of Democrats agreed.
That's a massive gap in perception. What does Rothstein say about that discrepancy?
He argues that it reveals a fundamental misunderstanding about how deeply racial inequality is baked into our systems. He says white Americans tend to focus on those legal and political wins since the civil rights movement and think, okay, we're good. But they completely miss those persistent economic and social disparities that are still holding back black communities.
It's like they're looking at the surface and not seeing the structures underneath.
Exactly. And Rothstein is adamant that it's just not that simple. We need to look beyond those formal legal changes and really examine how systemic racism continues to play out. And even the progress we have made can be fragile, easily reversed. Just look at what's happening with attacks on voting rights and affirmative action.
It's a stark reminder that we can't get complacent. The fight's far from over.
Absolutely. We have to keep pushing for change. And it's not about punishing white people or making anyone feel guilty.
Right, it's about understanding the problem and working together to create a more just and equitable society for everyone.
Exactly. And he reminds us that progress is possible. Things have changed for the better. And they can continue to change if we learn from the past and commit to building a better future.
One of the things that makes Rothstein's work so powerful is that he connects those dots between the past and the present, showing how the policies of yesterday are still impacting us today. And he does it in a way that's informative and inspiring.
He is. He's such a brilliant writer, a passionate advocate for justice. His work is essential reading for anyone who really wants to understand the history of racial inequality in America and be part of the solution.
So, with all that in mind, what's the one thing you want our listeners to take away from this deep dive?
Rothstein challenges us to reflect on our own communities. Consider the legacy of segregation in our own backyards. What steps can we take, individually and collectively, to really promote integration and racial equity?
It's a powerful call to action. It's not just about housing, it's about creating a society where everyone has the opportunity to thrive, regardless of their background, their race, where they came from.
Beautifully said.
Well, that's all the time we have for today's deep dive. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey. It's been such an insightful conversation.
Thank you for having me.
And to our listeners, we hope this conversation has given you some new insights and inspired you to learn more. Pick up Rothstein's books, The Color of Law and Just Action. They're powerful reads.
And remember, this isn't just about understanding history. It's about taking action to change the present and build a better future.
Beautifully said. Thanks for listening. We'll see you on our next deep dive.
And it's not just about individual successes either. There are some amazing stories about, communities coming together to create more equitable spaces.
Oh, yeah. Give us an example.
Well, there's Modesto, California.
What happened there?
So these two teachers, Jobana Peralta and Darshan Vijay Kumar, they're looking at a deed, right? And they stumble across this language that explicitly bars non-white people from owning property in that neighborhood.
I mean, it's just shocking that that kind of language was just written right there in the deed.
Right. They were so blown away that they decided to do something about it.
Good for them.
Yeah. So they start digging deeper, doing some research, and they find out that these restrictive covenants are all over Modesto.
Of course.
So they team up with the NAACP, and they launch this whole campaign to raise awareness and push for change.
Love it.
They created this whole online inventory of every subdivision in Modesto, documenting all the racist language they found in the deeds. And then they started giving presentations, at community groups, schools, even the city council.
Amazing. Just shining a light on this hidden history.
Exactly. It really sparked a movement for change in Modesto.
That's so inspiring.
It really is.
Yeah.
And it shows the power of just, getting curious, asking questions, and refusing to let these injustices slide.
Absolutely. We need more of that. And we need policies at all levels, from local communities to the federal government, that actually promote integration.
Rothstein talks about things like inclusionary zoning, which requires developers to include a certain percentage of affordable housing units in new developments.
So that you don't just end up with these enclaves of wealth that are inaccessible to lower-income families.
Exactly. And he also argues for reforming the low-income housing tax credit program.
Oh, yeah. Tell us about that.
So right now, that program is often structured in a way that actually reinforces segregation. Rothstein wants those tax credits to be used to build affordable housing in high-opportunity neighborhoods, not just concentrate poverty in already segregated areas.
Makes sense. We need to be breaking down those barriers, not reinforcing them.
Right. And it's not just about policy, it's about changing hearts and minds, too.
Absolutely. We need to shift our culture to one where diversity is truly valued and celebrated. This conversation has been pretty heavy at times, but also incredibly insightful.
I agree. It's important to talk about these issues, even when they're uncomfortable.
Absolutely. And one of the things I really appreciate about Rothstein's work is that he doesn't just lay out the problems, he offers real solutions.
He does. And he grounds those solutions in these powerful personal stories that really bring the issue to life.
Yes. Let's talk about some of those stories from Just Action. What were some that stood out to you?
Oh, there are so many. But one that really resonated with me was the story of Elizabeth Julian.
Who was she?
She's an attorney who sued HUD and the city of Dallas over their discriminatory housing policies.
Wow.
And her lawsuit actually paved the way for Bernestine Williams, a black mother, to move her family to a middle-class, integrated neighborhood.
So it had a real, tangible impact on people's lives.
Exactly. And it's a great example of how legal action can be used to fight for justice.
It's inspiring for sure.
And then there's the story of Marquita Bryant, a single mom in D.C. who bought a townhouse in a wealthy neighborhood, thanks to a program that specifically helps Black and Hispanic first-time home buyers with down payments.
Love that. It's so important to have programs that specifically address those systemic disadvantages.
Right. It's about leveling the playing field.
Absolutely.
And it's not just individual successes either. You know, Rothstein also highlights those community efforts that are working to make things more equitable. He talks about, what was it called? Oak Park, Illinois.
I've heard of Oak Park.
Yeah, they've been intentionally working toward racial diversity and integration for, like, over 50 years. And they've had incredible success.
It's proof that these efforts can really pay off, create a more just and thriving community for everyone.
Exactly. It's not just a pipe dream. It can be done.
It's inspiring.
Right.
And it gives me hope. So, we've talked a lot about the history of segregation, the policies that created it, and the ongoing impact it has today. But I think it's really important to emphasize that this isn't just an abstract intellectual exercise. It's about real people's lives.
Absolutely.
And Rothstein drives that point home with all those personal stories he weaves into his books.
Those stories are what make his work so compelling, so moving.
I agree. They put a human face on these systemic issues.
And they remind us that behind every statistic, every policy, there are real people whose lives are being impacted.
It's a powerful reminder to stay engaged, to keep fighting for change.
Because this fight is far from over.
You're right. We can't afford to be complacent.
We have to keep pushing for a more just and equitable society for everyone.
Well said. And I think Rothstein gives us a roadmap for how to do that, both in The Color of Law and Just Action.
He does. He lays out concrete steps we can take, individually and collectively, to dismantle these systems of oppression.
And he reminds us that change is possible.
We can create a better future if we're willing to do the work.
Well, on that note of hope and possibility, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive.
I agree. It's been a really thought-provoking conversation.
Thank you so much for joining me on this journey. It's been an absolute pleasure.
The pleasure was all mine.
And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in. We hope this deep dive has challenged your assumptions, expanded your understanding, and inspired you to get involved in the fight for racial justice.
Pick up Richard Rothstein's books, The Color of Law and Just Action. They're essential reading for anyone who wants to understand this crucial issue.
And remember, this isn't just about learning about the past, it's about taking action to create a better future. A future where everyone has the opportunity to thrive, regardless of their race or background.
Beautifully said.
Thanks for listening, everyone. We'll see you on our next deep dive.